Murder suspect Abner Aquiline released from Mount Carmel and interrogated by police. Children saved by Potino Cares pay tribute during Victor Calvania's funeral. And cocaine users make up majority of Malta's rehab centre residents. All this and more on today's episode of Lovin Daily. Good evening, Malta and Gozo, and welcome to another episode of Lovin Daily. My name is Evega Karpani, and joined with me is Jonathan Celia. It's a cold and windy day out there, so let's get right into the headlines for the day.
You know, a big development in a story that, I think everyone in Malta is following. Murder suspect Abner Aquiline has been released from Mount Carmel and has been taken to the Floriana Police Depot for further interrogation. Now, if you're not aware, Abner Aquiline is a murder suspect in the murder of Polish national Paulina Dębska, a murder and rape that has rocked the island. Once Abner had initially been apprehended, during the initial interrogation, he had said some very strange things that led to experts being called in, and these experts advised that the interrogation should stop and Abner should be taken to Mount Carmel for further assessment. However, that time period has ended and Abner has now been taken back in by police and has been interrogated. Now, this is a very, very important, kind of development, because many people are wondering, is Abner Aquiline going to plead insanity? Is his defense lawyers going to find a way to kind of prove that he wasn't there? Maybe he has an alibi. So the fact that the interrogation is now back on and we have some other key developments is a really great sign for people hoping for justice in this case.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those stories that, still has no end in sight, and people are very emotional about every single update about the story. It seems like, thankfully, with today's update, things can finally move on a little bit as well, so that eventually, of course, justice for the murder of this young 29-year-old woman will hopefully get a little bit closer to that. In fact, there are reports that have started coming out as of a couple of minutes ago that Abner might very well be charged tomorrow, so stay tuned on Lovin Malta for updates on that. It's definitely going to be something that we will continue talking about in the days and the weeks to come, because, well, it's already been a couple of weeks and we're still here. Meanwhile, in sadly another tragic story that also started a couple of weeks ago, today saw the emotional send-off and funeral and celebration of the life of Victor Calvania. This happened earlier today in the Mosta Rotunda, where scores of Calvania's friends, family, and even prominent politicians like Prime Minister Roberta Bela and opposition leader Bernard Grech, even Health Minister Chris Fearn at a point, were seen present, celebrating the life of this very important, very beloved doctor and Potino Cares founder. But beyond all of that, beyond the names that we all know and have seen before, there was, even more importantly and even more touchingly, the young girls and the boys who have been treated by Victor Calvania, whose lives Victor Calvania touched, and in some point, in some case, these lives were saved by Potino Cares and Calvania himself. There were emotional scenes of, flowers being laid at the altar and a number of photos. I mean, it was all a very beautiful but very emotional send-off.
Absolutely. I was watching the live stream myself, and you can follow the live stream on lovinmalta.com. As David said, there was, the elite of Maltese politicians there. There were some powerful people, but I couldn't stop looking at the children, they just entered the church quietly, carrying wreaths of flowers. And some of these children are alive specifically because of the input and impact of Victor Calvania and the whole Potino Cares team. So, if you ever needed proof of why these charities are so essential in Maltese society, look at the video, look at those living children and their families who get to live another day and after finding support in their darkest hour. So if you want to see the funeral, definitely check it out on lovinmalta.com. A very interesting set of numbers have come out from from Parliament, a question in Parliament. So Social Justice Minister Michael Falzon has confirmed that, there are 61 people within Maltese rehab centres for cocaine dependency specifically, which makes cocaine the most common drug that people are dependent on in Malta. So obviously this is a very interesting little insight in kind of the drug policy and the drug use on the island. There are 28 people in rehab centres for heroin addiction, and there are 22 people for alcohol addiction as well. There's also 12 people who are habitual cannabis users. So it kind of goes to show kind of, the makeup of people in rehab centers, which substances are more dangerous and more, effective at getting you hooked, and also kind of which people actually sought help for that. If you remember back in 2019, Lovin Malta had done quite of a big analysis on cocaine use on the island. We had spoken to a number of police sources who told us, quote, it is common among people whether they are 40-year-old plus in a casino or a 20-year-old in a club. So, clearly cocaine is a very, very popular substance in Malta, and some people are seeking help because of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's always very important, to have these numbers, to see the larger picture, to see the bigger picture in context, also to see what our fellow citizens are suffering from the most. And I think one person put it best, commenting under our story, where she said, I come from a country where cocaine is, like in many other countries, seen as a hard drug, which is very hard to come by. But in Malta, she has observed, she shared with us the story of how unsettlingly prevalent it might be, and she even puts it. She describes it as the silent epidemic that people have. Wow. So very important, to keep in mind and to remember just how much of a problem the country might have with certain drugs. Meanwhile, on to a not so silent pandemic. The World Health Organization has sounded a warning on the current COVID-19 dominant variant, the Omicron, saying that half of Europe might very well be infected by Omicron in the next 2 months. Now, well, call me optimistic, but I think that's technically good news, but we'll get onto that very soon. The projection was based on something which isn't that great news. It's the fact that 7 million people across the continent have been infected just over the first week of 2022, so not the ideal start to the year. The World Health Organization, the WHO European Director Hans Kluge even described it as, a west to east tidal wave. We've been hearing about waves for quite some time, but never in such apocalyptic terms. But of course, it is very important to remember that this variant, while definitely more contagious, and we are seeing that it can, in fact, infect vaccinated people, even fully vaccinated people, it is seemingly less likely to trigger serious illnesses, which is a fact that can be reflected in the numbers, which we'll relay to you very soon. And at the same time, of course, there is a concerted effort which Malta seems to be heading when it comes to protecting our citizens. I mean, just today, Health Minister Chris Fearn announced that 2/3 of all adults residing in Malta, that's 63%, are already boosted. There's countries, we just had a story today about how Quebec is still battling its first dose to deliver that to people. And just 2 days ago, Pfizer has announced that a vaccine against Omicron should be rolled out by March. So hopefully we're very soon bound to get this behind us.
Yeah, no, Malta definitely, like the rest of the world, is very much in the pandemic. In fact, when you look at today's COVID-19 numbers, 4 people died while COVID positive. Those are 3 males and 1 female, which means that the national death toll has increased to 496. So we're about to hit very, very shortly, unfortunately, hopefully not, 500 deaths related to COVID-19 on the island alone. So, that's 500 families that have to deal with the tragedy of losing a loved one, especially in such a unfortunate way. Moving on to the final story and talking about important dates. This week marks 2 years of Prime Minister Roberto Bella as the leader of the nation. Now, this evening, Lovin Malta will be publishing a long read, a nice analysis, kind of going over the highs and lows of Bella's tenure, but and I definitely invite you to read that. But I'm just going to go through some of the key points here, just so we kind of look back over the last 2 years and some of the most important and most shameful moments of his tenure. So, after taking over the role of Prime Minister, he quickly replaced some very controversial and key names. I think some of the most important ones to point out, it was Police Commissioner Lawrence Cotayar. If you remember, this guy was a major figure in the Joseph Muscat administration. He was famously having a fencata during a very, very key point in time. Not only him, former Attorney General Peter Grech, People had many questions over how impartial he was as well. These were very, very much replaced soon after Robert Abela took power. However, it wasn't all easy sailing. Just recently we had Justine Caruana, the saga of Justine Caruana, where many people believe she probably should have been kicked out of government way sooner than she was. We also have cases like Rosiane Kutayar, who, while she was kicked out of cabinet, she remains part of the Labour administration, and I believe she's probably going to get re-elected during the next election, probably reinstated in cabinet, even though there are major questions over her connections with murder suspect Jorgen Fenech, the murder suspect in Daphne Caruana Galizia case, and how close she was to him and how she was given thousands while brokering an Indina property deal. But in better news, Angelo Gaffa was instated as the new police commissioner, and even speaking to police sources, many people do really feel a difference under Gaffa. They believe that the police force has now got more dignity, more self-respect, and is much quicker on the cases. And I think even looking at financial crimes, you are seeing that the police are acting faster than they ever have before, even though there are obviously still major areas where they can improve. A very questionable area is the amount of co-options that Robert Abela has had for his administration. People like Clyde Caruana, Miriam Dudley, Oliver Shikluna, Jonathan Attard, and Andy Alul is just the latest. These people were all given positions of powers or becoming MPs or even cabinet members without getting elected. So, while people like Chris Cardona and Conrad Mitzi might have been kicked out, the way some people were brought in is very questionable and might not be the most democratic way, even though technically it's legal. And let's not forget, obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic. Soon after Abela took power, the pandemic hit the island and hit the world seriously. I think, he was criticized for, maybe being too strong in implementing some policies, as well as having the lockdowns and the airport controls as well. But I think on the whole, I think many people would agree, and do let us know in the comments below whether you agree or disagree, that on the whole, Abela has handled this, pandemic that many people weren't able to really predict in a pretty good way. I mean, yes, we are approaching 500 deaths. However, when you look at other nations, the situation is much more grim. And I think a very surprising moment, just to end off here, with Robert Abela, especially someone that was seen as a very conservative person, who was a former lawyer that worked closely with Caritas, is the regulation of cannabis, the cannabis law that just happened last month, something that policymakers around the world are now looking at little old Malta for. I don't think many people were expecting this to happen so soon. Just 2 years into his tenure, we had Reforms Minister Owen Bonici kind of push it along after Rosiane Kutayar kind of really gave it a big push. This is definitely going to be a feather in his cap when people look at the history of Malta. This is going to be part of the history books. This is a pioneering moment for Europe, and Robert Abela was the man that kind of gave the green light for that. So, these are some of the highlights of his tenure. Definitely let us know in the comments below what you make. How would you rate Robert Abela's tenure over the last 2 years ahead of the next election?
Yeah, that was perfectly succinct. I mean, looking at 2 years, when you put it that way, when you put the context of everything that has happened, I know that it doesn't feel like that long ago, especially as far as 10 years go, but let's not forget just how much happened since Sunday, 12th January 2020. I think Robert Abela got like 50 days in as a normal tenure as a prime minister before, Malta had its first case of COVID-19, and it's been a rough roller coaster even without COVID-19 thrown in the mix. So it's definitely been a very long, very eventful 2 years, which I think not many people admittedly could have weathered as well or as at least decently as Abela has. Of course, the future is yet to be seen. Here's hoping the next 2 years don't feel as long as the last 2 years have been, on even some unrelated terms. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Have an evening full of lovin'.